Our session is called The Awakening Consciousness, The Invisible Shift. Peter Russell is the author of 10 books, including Global Brain Awakens, The Creative Manager, Waking Up in Time, and From Science to God, and the producer of the award-winning The Global Brain. In the 1970s, he pioneered the introduction of personal development programs in business. His work integrates Eastern and Western understandings of the mind, and they're exploring their relevance to the world today and to humanity's future. Please welcome Peter Russell for our session.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, as from the title, today what I want to do is look at the bigger picture and at what I see is happening underneath the whole LOHAS phenomena. Because I see this is just the surface of something much deeper that's happening in our culture. And I remember Ted in his opening remarks yesterday was saying how, you know, we're talking about consumer consciousness, social consciousness, environmental consciousness. And it's all in a way about consciousness. And so what I want to look at is what is the underlying shift in consciousness that's happening. So I think there's something, say, much deeper that's going on, which is really what's fueling this whole thing. I mean, part of what's fueling it is realizing we can't go on polluting the planet. We've got to be more sustainable. We're realizing the impact of chemicals on our health. There's various things. There's the knowledge that's coming along that's really part of it. But there's also something deeper that's happening. It's what Steve was talking about also on the first day, that shift in values. And it's that shift in values which is the part I want to look at, and where that's coming from, and what it actually means. And I see that as part of a much deeper spiritual shift that's going on, which really began back in the 60s. And some of you here may be old enough to have actually been part of that. I was. That's why I talk about it. It was, for those who were there, it was a fascinating time. I see it as part of a creative thing that happened. Some of you know something about the creative process. With the creative process in an individual, the first part of the creative process, you do a lot of thinking, you get dissatisfied, you come across problems, you try things out. And then there's usually that moment of insight. But that moment of insight is just the beginning of then a whole new phase, which is how do you turn the insight into reality? How do you actually make things? How do you change things? And I see the 60s were a moment of insight for our culture. And there was the insight that the old way of working wasn't working anymore, and that there was the possibility of a new mode of consciousness, a new way of looking at things. And it was sort of summarized probably by the Beatles with that song, All You Need Is Love, which interestingly was the first ever live global satellite broadcast. Their recording of All You Need Is Love was the first ever global live satellite broadcast. An interesting tidbit there. And in a way that's true, you know, if we really did come from love in our relationships, with our love for the environment, if we really did come from that, the world would be a very different place. But then how do you do it? I think that's what has been part of what society has been working on, is how do we turn this into actuality? That was a great moment of vision, of things could be different, but things didn't change. We're then involved in a long process of change. And I think what happened was those people who were spiritual seekers back then realized you didn't get there by dropping acid. Or maybe you got there, you got there that day, and you remembered it for a while. But there was that realization, drugs weren't the way, and people started looking to Eastern religion, and there was a phase we went through I'm talking we collectively, where there's that sort of, we were enamored by Eastern gurus and Eastern philosophy. And there's a lot in there that we learnt. And then there's a realization, but no, it isn't about that. There's something else that's more homegrown here. It isn't, we don't just have to go to the East. And after what I call the age of the guru, there was then the age of the great big workshops, the things like EST, actualizations, those sorts of workshops, which were really coming from people who'd explored Eastern religions, Zen, various things, and they were sort of synthesizing that and integrating that into a sort of Western workshop, and that was another phase we went through. And I think we came back to realizing it was more personal, and that there was deep personal work that needed to be doing, and I think just many people began to see the value of self-healing work, whether it was through therapy or many different avenues, but really just working on themselves, freeing themselves from the various things that keep us disconnected from our true nature. And in that time, particularly I think in the last 10 years, what we've seen is the emergence of real Western spiritual teachers. In the Buddhist movement, people like Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, who back in the 60s went out east and studied and came back and have just been teaching and gradually honing, refining that teaching. And there's many others. I mean, I think of people like Adyashanti, who's risen up in recent years. Eckhart Tolle is somebody who's very well known to many of you. And there's a fascinating phenomenon I see that's happening here. One is we're simplifying what this awakening is, this awakening of consciousness. It's getting simpler and simpler in terms of our understanding and also in terms of the practice. And we're realizing it's nothing to do with religion. I just want to make this clear. Spirituality, to me, is nothing to do with religion. What I see has happened is, at times in the past, people have got in touch with their own essence, their own true nature, whatever you want to call it, this state of consciousness, this state of being, in which we are liberated. We are liberated from the petty fears, the worries, the mental stuff that keeps us trapped and keeps us sort of in our little egos. And there's this state of liberation that happens. It comes in many different ways, and I'll talk a bit more about what that's like in a moment. And people who go through that, they want to share it. It's something which is powerful for them. It's often life-transforming. They want to share it with other people. And so when they start doing that, but inevitably you have the enlightened people talking about enlightenment to less than enlightened people, their students. And some of those get it. They don't get all of it. They may misunderstand bits of it. It gets reabsorbed into the culture of the time. And what gradually happens over time as it's passed down from one generation to another and one culture to another is it actually gets complexified. Stuff gets added on, becomes a sort of big metaphysical tradition, and ultimately becomes a religion. It becomes a belief system that you need to adhere to or believe in. It's a process which I sometimes jokingly call truth decay. It's like the truth gradually decays over time and gets lost. And very hard to find. I think what is happening today that makes it fascinating is from many different directions we are going back and saying, what is that essential wisdom that inspired so many of these great spiritual traditions, which appear so different on the surface? But I come at it from the assumption that underneath they're all talking about the same phenomena, and it doesn't need to be put in spiritual or even religious terms. It can be put in very down-to-earth, everyday, practical terms. And that's actually been part of my own work. I spent about 15 years working in corporations, running programs, seminars, taking the ideas that I was finding really fascinating to me around human consciousness, the awakening of human consciousness, and putting them in the language, the examples, the practices that ordinary people whose concerns were meeting their quarterly budget and paying their kids' school bills, that they could relate to, people who would run a mile if I said anything, quote, spiritual or woo-woo. And I think that's really important. I think any wisdom like this needs to be put in contemporary language, contemporary terms.